Imagine living in a washing machine. That'd be pretty hard, right? You'd never know when someone would turn it on, and you'd be thrown around with water flying all over you randomly, never knowing when it's going to stop or start. It's crazy.
Well, that's what it's like to live in the intertidal zone. Depending on what section you live in, the tide can be pretty harsh, and you'd have to learn how to deal with being in the sun for hours, being randomly submerged in water, increased water temperatures, having tides smack you in the face, and low oxygen levels, all leaving you vulnerable to predators. That must be pretty hard, right?
Yeah, but before we get into that, here are some things that you should know. High tide is when the water goes back in and it reaches the highest point the water can reach, but low tide is when the water goes back out and all the rocks and sea life are revealed. But remember, the main dangers are being in the sun too long, low oxygen levels, and being submerged in water randomly. Let's get back into it. These are all real dangers that organisms in the intertidal zone face regularly, but they have all kinds of ways they've adapted. So, today I'm going to talk about unique zones and all those adaptations that help them survive.
Let's get into it.
Organisms tend to live in or on the rocky shorelines of the intertidal zone for various reasons. Barnacles, mussels, and kelps anchor themselves to rocks and hold in water in their closed shells to keep them from drying out when it's low tide. Quick note, low tide is when the water levels drop and most organisms get their air exposure, and high tide is when the water goes back up and they can kind of replenish and just soak in all that water while it lasts. Because, they don't get a lot of that time. It's really hard life out there. Organisms who can't survive in these low tide conditions, like sea stars, shrimp, and fish, find homes in the cracks and crevices of rocks where seawater collects. But these rocks have different zones where organisms collect. There are 5 different zones with 3 main zones. The first zone is the low tide zone. This is the lowest the tide can reach. Just below is the subtidal zone. But this is where you can find the ochre sea star, the purple sea urchin, eelgrass, surfgrass, and feather kelp boa, which are all found in Oregon. In the low tide zone, you'll usually find sea stars, algae, snails, seaweed, and crabs. Moving upward is the mid-tide zone. My favorite! This is the area just below the average sea level to the upper limit of the lowest tides. This area generally has a dense cover of algae, providing food and shelter for animals. This area is also a perfect in-between between air and water exposure, and species like gooseneck barnacles, coralline algae, giant green anemones, and sea palms are found here, and are also all found in Oregon. This zone is great because organisms aren't exposed for air for too long, resulting in more animals living here. Next is the high tide zone. This is the area from the average high tide to just below the average sea level. Organisms found here are hermit crabs, sea lettuce, and acorn barnacles, which, you guessed it, are all found in Oregon. At high tide, the organisms get nutrients from microscopic creatures such as plankton that wash up on them with the water and nourish them so that they can become food for larger animals. Above this zone is the splash zone, where a few organisms live, but it's relatively possible for them to live here. As we talked about earlier, there are a lot of challenges that these organisms face. Those challenges include low oxygen levels, hours of sun exposure, increased water temperatures, and vulnerability to predators. Now, biotic factors have several ways to deal with this. For example, some organisms attach to rocks like feather kelp boa. They do this with a tissue called their holdfast, which allows them to survive even when the surf is rough. Seagrasses, shoalgrass, eelgrass, and surfgrass rely on their roots to anchor them in place. Similarly, the purple sea urchin burrows itself into rocks with its sharp teeth. Those spines also spear food and protect from predators. But what they all have in common is they have to anchor themselves in order to fight the water. Giant green anemones use the stinging cells on its tentacles to paralyze its prey. But to fight against the abiotic factors, as adults, they have tentacles that can be as long as 10 inches. With these tentacles, they can grab nearby shells or rocks hanging by, and they can use that as a way to fight against the UV rays. But they use these rocks to reflect the UV rays and to fight against the sun. Many adaptations are to protect organisms from predators, but a fair amount are also for keeping from drying out. A perfect example of this are gooseneck barnacles, who have many plates that the stem attaches to. These plates protect the body from predators and from drying out. Acorn barnacles protect themselves with their shell, and a fun adaptation is that they trap water in their shells during low tide to keep from drying out. Two main organisms that have a hard time with the heat might surprise you, because they're hermit crabs and the ochre sea star. Hermit crabs use pools and crevices of water to wet their gills and interior of their shells, as they need a humidity of 50 to 70%. Now, the ochre sea star can tolerate a longer time period to air than many other sea stars. Regularly, they withstand up to 8 hours of exposure during low tides. In laboratory conditions, they've tolerated up to 50 hours out of water with little harm. It's insane what these little creatures can do without us even noticing. That was a lot of information at once. Let's do a quick recap. There are the subtidal, low tide, mid tide, high tide, and splash zones of the intertidal zone. These biotic factors have abiotic dangers like high sun exposure, low oxygen levels, vulnerability to predators, and increased water temperatures. Most organisms here adapt not to dry out, to protect themselves from predators, or to get food. And remember, living in the intertidal zone is rougher, tougher, and gruffer than you ever imagined. Peace out, suckers!